In a quiet neighborhood of New York, where trees form a canopy of shade during the summer and cobblestone streets echo the sound of hurried footsteps, the Strickland family resides. Their daughter, Emily, a sophisticated woman with a strong personality, had been married to the charming and ambitious Jason for 2 years. They seemed like the perfect couple. Jason, with his promising career on Wall Street, appeared to be the ideal man for Emily, who had a comfortable life filled with high expectations. However, there was one thing that deeply worried Beatrice Strickland, Emily's mother, a woman of 58 years who had always been cautious with her daughter's choices. Beatrice did not fully trust Jason, and despite her best efforts to conceal it, her distrust grew with each passing day. She knew that Jason's charm and appearance could be just as seductive as they were dangerous. Beatrice, then, decided to test her son-in-law's loyalty without him knowing, with a carefully crafted plan. Jason and Emily were spending the weekend at a secluded country house in upstate New York, where they hoped to escape the pressures of the city. The idea was to relax, but Beatrice, who was aware of the plan, had other intentions. She had already found a moment to subtly insert herself into the scene and closely observe Jason's behavior. With Emily busy with some of the many tasks she loved to carry out in the house, Beatrice saw an opportunity to begin what she considered an evaluation. Beatrice knew Jason had a good heart, but she couldn't just trust his words. So, she began testing his reactions, offering him subtle opportunities to disrespect or deceive her daughter. First, Beatrice invited him to a private lunch at an elegant restaurant in the area, known as the Lantern. The ambience was cozy, with dim lights and walls adorned with paintings of pastoral landscapes. Jason, as always, was sharp in conversation, flashing his smile, eager to impress. But Beatrice, with her sharp eyes, watched every move he made, testing his patience and character. The conversation started light, discussing the local weather and their trip to the country house. But soon Beatrice began bringing up more personal topics, asking about Jason's future with Emily, his intentions, and what he really thought about their marriage. Jason, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, maintained his composure. He knew Beatrice was a demanding and hard-to-please woman, but his answers remained measured and polite. He spoke about how much he loved Emily, how he wanted a stable and happy life with her, and how she was the woman of his dreams. Beatrice, however, was not convinced. She decided to intensify the test, introducing more delicate topics about loyalty and trust. She began talking about the challenges of a relationship, suggesting that everyone would face moments of temptation. She wanted to see how he would react if placed in a tempting situation. But Jason, with the skill of a seasoned negotiator, deflected and stayed calm. For him, nothing could shake his commitment to Emily. Beatrice smiled inwardly, knowing that the real test was yet to come. She was now planning a scenario where Jason would face his greatest temptation. The next phase of the plan was about to be set in motion. And Beatrice was determined to find out what her son-in-law was really capable of in order to remain loyal to her daughter. The next day, after their light-hearted lunch at the Lantern, Beatrice put her plan into motion. She knew Jason would be spending the afternoon with Emily, exploring the nearby trails and enjoying the countryside. The perfect moment had arrived for her to orchestrate her next move. Beatrice had arranged for a woman named Claire, an old family friend, to visit the country house under the guise of dropping by to catch up with Emily and her husband. Claire was a stunning woman, charismatic and confident, with an easy charm that could win anyone over. Beatrice knew that if there was any way to test Jason's loyalty, it would be through Claire. Her idea was simple: put Jason in a situation where his commitment to Emily would be tested, all while keeping her distance and watching from afar. As Beatrice set the stage, Claire arrived, perfectly timed. As Emily and Jason were finishing their walk, she greeted them with enthusiasm, hugging both Emily and Jason as though she had known them for years. Her appearance was flawless, her hair perfectly styled, her dress form-fitting yet elegant. Beatrice, from the porch, watched as Claire chatted easily with Emily and Jason, making sure that the evening would unfold as planned. Jason, always the gentleman, was polite to Claire, but there was a noticeable tension in the air as Beatrice kept her eyes locked on him from the distance. The subtle tension was enough for Beatrice to gauge his reactions. She had seen this dynamic before. A beautiful woman, a friendly invitation, and a husband who might not be as steadfast as he appeared. After some time, Emily excused herself to handle a few things inside the house, leaving Jason and Claire alone in the garden. Beatrice's heart raced as she observed the two from the window. Jason, who had always been respectful to his wife's mother, didn't seem to notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Claire, with a coy smile, stood much closer to Jason than Emily would ever allow in private, brushing her hand against his arm as she spoke. Jason, it's been so long since we've all gotten together. Hasn't it? Claire's voice was soft, a little too familiar. I remember how Emily used to talk about you when she was younger. She always said you were perfect for her. Jason smiled politely, though his eyes seemed distant, distracted by the beauty of the surroundings rather than by the conversation. Beatrice, noticing this, felt a mix of frustration and satisfaction. Jason was not acting overtly inappropriate, but the undercurrent of tension was clear. The question was whether or not he would cross the line. Claire continued, sensing the opening. You know, I've always admired your ambition. It must be exciting, having so much ahead of you, she said, moving a step closer, her tone softer, more intimate. Jason, momentarily flustered, cleared his throat. I appreciate that, Claire, but it's all about balance. Emily and I are very happy. His words, though genuine, were laced with a sense of discomfort. Beatrice could see that Jason was trying his best to remain composed, but Claire's charm was undeniably making an impact. The interaction continued for several minutes, with Claire becoming more and more confident in her role. She was pushing boundaries, testing how far Jason would go, all under the watchful eye of Beatrice. From inside the house, Emily could hear the soft laughter and the sound of conversation, unaware of the delicate dance happening right outside. Beatrice's heart pounded as she considered her next move. It was clear that Jason hadn't made any overt advances, but the seed of doubt was being planted. Her plan was working. Suddenly, Beatrice's phone buzzed. It was a message from Claire. He's a little too polite, a little too nervous. I can tell he's trying to stay faithful. Beatrice nodded to herself. It seemed like Jason was doing just enough to maintain the illusion of loyalty. But would it be enough? The real test would come soon, she knew. As the afternoon wore on, Emily returned to the garden, greeting Claire warmly before they all went inside to enjoy dinner. Jason seemed more relaxed now, as if he had shaken off the weight of the test. Beatrice was left to wonder, would her son-in-law truly pass the ultimate test? Or was he simply playing a role? Days passed, and the country house remained a tranquil haven for the Stricklands, though the undercurrent of tension never completely disappeared. Beatrice, ever watchful, continued to observe Jason's behavior, now with even greater scrutiny, while Jason had done his best to remain a picture of loyalty during his interactions with Claire. Beatrice was still unsure whether he was truly as faithful as he claimed. Beatrice decided it was time to escalate her plan. She knew that the key to understanding Jason's true character lay in his actions when faced with temptation, especially when Emily wasn't around to provide a moral anchor. To do this, Beatrice needed to ensure that Jason's loyalty would be put to the ultimate test. One evening, after dinner, Beatrice suggested to Emily that she and Jason take a walk down the nearby trail to get some fresh air. Emily, delighted by the idea, agreed, leaving Beatrice alone in the house. Once they were out of sight, Beatrice made her move. She quickly texted Claire, who had been staying nearby, to inform her of the perfect opportunity. Claire responded almost instantly, I'm on my way. Within an hour, Claire arrived at the house, wearing an outfit that was both alluring and casual, tight jeans and a loose-fitting top that accentuated her figure. Beatrice smiled inwardly as she saw Claire approach the door. Remember, Beatrice whispered as Claire entered the living room. This time, make him believe you're interested. I need to know if he'll succumb to temptation. Claire nodded, her face a mixture of determination and excitement. I know what to do. Just trust me. Beatrice led her to the garden, where Jason had often taken a break to relax. With a knowing glance, Beatrice left the two alone, knowing the situation would unfold exactly as she planned. Jason, alone in the garden, appeared to be lost in thought when Claire arrived. She approached him casually, wearing a bright smile. Jason, it's a beautiful night, don't you think? She asked, her voice light and inviting. Jason turned his head, a little startled, but smiled politely. Yeah, it's nice out here. There was an awkward pause, and for a moment, Claire and Jason stood there, looking at the stars above. Beatrice, watching from inside, felt her heart race. It was in moments like this that Jason's true character would be revealed. Claire broke the silence, stepping a little closer. You know, it's been a while since I've spent time with someone as interesting as you, she said, her voice laced with playful flirtation. Emily's lucky to have you. Jason shifted uncomfortably, his eyes narrowing slightly. I'm sure she'd say the same about you, Claire. You've always been a good friend to her. Claire's eyes twinkled. She was getting closer, sensing his discomfort. Well, maybe. But, Jason, I've always found you intriguing. There's something about you, something that makes me wonder if there's more between us than you're willing to admit. Jason took a step back, his face flushing as he tried to process what she was saying. Claire, that's not. Before he could finish his sentence, Claire reached out, gently touching his arm. You don't have to deny it. I can see it in your eyes. The way you look at me. There's chemistry between us, and I think you know it. She took a step closer, now standing directly in front of him, her face just inches from his. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment, Jason's composure faltered. Beatrice, still watching from the window, gripped the curtains tightly. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Would Jason reject Claire, as he had done before, or would he succumb to the temptation she had so carefully crafted? Jason, his pulse quickening, took a deep breath. I'm married. Claire, Emily means everything to me. You know that. Claire smiled softly, her hand still on his arm. I understand, but don't you ever wonder what it would be like to have a little fun, to feel something new? Her words were slow and deliberate, as if she were planting seeds in his mind. Jason, his jaw tightening, finally stepped away from her, his voice firm. This isn't right. You're my wife's friend, and I respect her too much to do this. Claire sighed dramatically, her lips curling into a playful yet frustrated smile. It's a shame, she whispered, before stepping back, taking her hand off his arm. But I suppose I should respect your commitment. After all, you don't want to disappoint Emily. Jason, now visibly shaken, nodded. I don't. I won't. With that, Claire smiled, her eyes glittering with a mix of satisfaction and intrigue. She hadn't been able to break him, but she had certainly gotten under his skin. As Beatrice watched the scene unfold, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of disappointment. Jason had resisted, yes, but there had been a moment, just a moment, when she thought he might falter. It was a test that had revealed a crack in his armor, one that Beatrice wasn't sure she could ignore. Days turned into weeks, and Beatrice's scheme continued to unfold, but with each passing day, her feelings grew more complex. Watching Jason's every move, evaluating his interactions with Claire, and even observing his subtle reactions to her own subtle manipulations, Beatrice couldn't help but notice a growing tension within herself. What had started as a simple test to confirm Jason's loyalty to her daughter was starting to become something else, something unexpected. And it wasn't just Jason's reactions that intrigued her. It was her own shifting emotions. Beatrice had seen something in Jason, something raw and untamed. Despite his previous rejection of Claire's advances, there was a flicker of something more, something hidden beneath the surface of his carefully constructed persona. She had to admit that she was beginning to question her own intentions. Was this truly about protecting Emily, or was it more about her own desires? Her mind was in turmoil, but she knew one thing for sure. The test would continue. She needed to know how far Jason would go, even if it meant testing him in ways she hadn't anticipated. The next phase of the plan was simple. She needed to create another opportunity for Jason to be tested. This time, however, she would up the stakes. Claire would no longer be the only one trying to get close to him. Beatrice herself would step into the picture. It was risky, but Beatrice was determined to push the boundaries, to find out just how far Jason would go. One evening, after Emily had gone to bed early, Beatrice invited Jason to join her for a glass of wine on the porch. The night air was crisp, and the sky was full of stars. Jason, ever polite, accepted the invitation, though his unease was evident. They sat together, each with a glass of red wine in hand, and for a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, and Beatrice could feel the tension in the air. Jason finally broke the silence. I'm glad you and Emily are so close, he said. Looking out at the garden, she talks about you a lot, and she always says how much she appreciates your advice. Beatrice smiled softly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she regarded him. It's always been my role, hasn't it, to protect her, to make sure she's with someone who values her, who respects her. Jason nodded, taking a sip of his wine, his expression distant. I do respect her, Beatrice. I love her. You don't need to worry about that. Beatrice's lips curved into a faint smile. I know, but sometimes, Jason, love isn't enough. People are complex, and sometimes what we think is loyalty isn't true loyalty at all. It's easy to say you'll be faithful when things are simple, but what happens when temptation arises? What happens when you're faced with something you didn't expect? Jason shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering to hers. What are you trying to say? Beatrice leaned in slightly, her voice lowering, filled with intent. I'm saying that sometimes we don't know who we truly are until we're tested. You think you know yourself, but until you're put to the test, until you're forced to make a choice, you can't be sure. Jason swallowed hard, his grip tightening around his wine glass. I know who I am. I'm not going to hurt Emily. Beatrice's eyes flashed with a mix of challenge and intrigue. But how do you know? How do you know if you're capable of being faithful when you haven't been given a real challenge? There it was, her opening. Beatrice could see the slight flicker of doubt in Jason's eyes, a brief crack in his confidence. She pushed forward, her words calculated but dripping with an underlying, dangerous allure. Perhaps you think you can resist temptation when it's far away, when it's abstract. But what about now? What if temptation is sitting right here in front of you? Jason looked at her, his face frozen in a mixture of confusion and disbelief. What are you talking about, Beatrice? Beatrice let out a soft, almost amused laugh, setting her glass down on the porch railing. She leaned forward, her gaze fixed on him. I'm saying that I know you're attracted to me, Jason. You don't have to deny it. I've seen the way you look at me. It's normal, really. I'm just testing to see how strong your resolve truly is. I want to know if you'll still be loyal to Emily, or if, given the chance, you'll fall for someone else. Jason's face went pale, and he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Beatrice, this isn't right. You're my mother-in-law. I would never. Beatrice, however, stood too, her expression cold but composed. It's just a test, Jason. Don't you see? Everything we've been through, everything we've built, none of it matters if we don't know where our true loyalties lie. I'm just giving you the chance to prove yourself. Jason's hands shook slightly, and for a moment, Beatrice could see the internal struggle play out across his face. This was the moment of truth. He could leave, walk away, and maintain his honor, or he could stay and confront his feelings, whatever they may be. After what felt like an eternity, Jason finally spoke, his voice hoarse. I won't do this. I won't betray Emily. No matter what you say, no matter what you do, I won't be a part of this. Beatrice watched him, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of disappointment and fascination. For all his protestations, Jason had passed the test. For now, Jason had made his choice. Or so he believed. He had resisted temptation, as he had promised himself and Emily. But as days turned into weeks, Beatrice's presence continued to haunt him. Her words lingered in his mind, and the intensity of her gaze was impossible to ignore. Though he had physically rejected her advances, emotionally, Jason couldn't deny the complex feelings that had begun to stir within him. Beatrice, for all her calculated tests, had managed to plant a seed in his mind. It was a seed that Jason now found himself unable to remove, and the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if his resistance had truly been about loyalty, or simply about fear. Beatrice, too, seemed to be fighting a battle of her own. While she had been methodical in her approach, testing Jason at every turn, she found herself inexplicably drawn to him. At first, she had only seen him as a pawn in her game, a way to test her daughter's husband, but somewhere along the way, her feelings had shifted. What started as a test of loyalty had evolved into something more complicated, something darker. And so, the tension in the house between the three of them, Beatrice, Emily, and Jason, grew. Though Emily remained blissfully unaware, the cracks were beginning to show. There were moments, subtle moments, when Jason would look at Beatrice and hesitate, or when Beatrice would catch him looking at her when he thought she wasn't watching. These small instances, filled with unspoken thoughts, began to create an invisible chasm between them. One evening, Beatrice decided to confront Jason, though she had no clear idea of what she hoped to accomplish. It was late, after Emily had gone to bed, and Beatrice found herself on the porch again, staring at the stars. She wasn't sure why she had summoned him, or even what she would say. She only knew that she needed answers. Jason walked onto the porch, his expression guarded. Beatrice, what is it? What do you need? Beatrice took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the sky. I need to know where we stand, Jason, she said softly. This game, this test, it's not just a test anymore, is it? Jason shifted uncomfortably. I've told you, Beatrice. I won't betray Emily. I never will. But Beatrice wasn't convinced. She turned to face him, her gaze intense, searching for any hint of weakness in his resolve. You say that, but there's a part of you, isn't there? A part of you that wants something more. I can see it in your eyes. The way you look at me. Don't lie to me, Jason. I've watched you, and I know you felt it too. Jason's face flushed, and he opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. His internal conflict was evident in the way his fists clenched at his sides. Beatrice continued, her voice quieter now, but filled with the chilling certainty. I can't pretend anymore, Jason. I know you're drawn to me, and I know you want to be with me. You've wanted it from the very beginning, haven't you? It's why you couldn't resist the test. It's why you're still here, still playing along. Jason's heart raced as Beatrice's words cut through him. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. This isn't right, Beatrice. You're my mother-in-law. I can't feel that way about you. Beatrice stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. But you do, and that's what makes this so complicated. You've been tested, Jason, over and over again. But what happens when the test is no longer about Emily? What happens when the test is about you? Jason looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't do this. I won't betray her. Beatrice's lips curled into a smile. But it wasn't one of triumph, it was something darker, something more unsettling. You already have, Jason. You just don't know it yet. Before Jason could respond, Beatrice closed the distance between them. In one swift motion, she reached up and kissed him. At first, Jason stiffened, his hands raising instinctively to push her away. But then something inside him shifted. A mix of confusion, desire, and something deeper he couldn't name overwhelmed him, and before he knew it, his hands were tangled in her hair. The kiss deepened, slow and full of longing, as if both of them were giving into something they couldn't deny any longer. When they finally pulled away, breathless and shaken, Jason took a step back, his mind reeling. This is a mistake, he muttered, more to himself than to Beatrice. But Beatrice didn't back down. Maybe it's not. Maybe this is exactly what needed to happen. Maybe the test was always about this. Jason's world was spinning. He felt betrayed not by Emily, but by his own emotions, his own actions. He had come here to resist, to protect his marriage, but in this moment, he felt as though he had given in to something he couldn't control. I need to go, he said, his voice strained. But Beatrice stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. You're not going anywhere, Jason. Not yet. We need to talk about this. About what happens next. But Jason, his chest tight with anxiety, walked away without another word, leaving Beatrice alone on the porch, her mind both satisfied and unsettled by what had just transpired. The days that followed were a blur of guilt, confusion, and unspoken tension. Jason tried to avoid Beatrice, but it was impossible. Their encounters were now fraught with an undeniable charge, something neither of them could ignore. Jason had tried to convince himself that it was just a moment of weakness, a mistake born of too much wine and too much emotional strain. But the more he tried to push it away, the more it lingered in his mind, gnawing at him, demanding his attention. Beatrice, too, was struggling with her emotions. The kiss, the moment of intimacy they shared, had shaken her more than she had anticipated. She had never planned on letting things go this far, never intended to cross that line. But now that she had, she couldn't pretend it hadn't changed everything. It had shifted the power dynamic between them, made the test she had set up feel much more complicated. What had begun as a simple trial of loyalty was now an emotional minefield, with no clear path forward. Despite the undeniable tension between them, Beatrice and Jason continued to play their parts. Beatrice kept up the facade of the concerned, protective mother, while Jason remained the devoted fiancé. Though both of them knew the truth was no longer so simple. They were lying to Emily, lying to themselves, and both felt the weight of it every day. But Emily, blissfully unaware of the growing storm between her mother and her fiancé, continued to trust in the relationship. She had no idea that her mother had been testing Jason in such extreme ways, and she certainly had no idea that her fiancé and her mother had crossed a line neither of them could easily undo. One evening, after dinner, Beatrice invited Jason to her study under the guise of needing his help with something. She had prepared herself for this conversation, knew that it had to happen. There was no going back. The weight of their silence had grown unbearable, and she couldn't allow it to fester any longer. Jason, she began, once the door was shut behind them. We need to talk about what happened the other night. Jason froze, his face draining of color. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, they could pretend it never happened. But it was clear from Beatrice's stern expression that the truth was unavoidable. "Beatrice," he said, his voice tight, "we can't do this. We can't keep going like this." Beatrice moved closer, her voice calm but insistent. "But we have to, Jason. We've already crossed this line. Pretending it didn't happen would be a lie. We both know it." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. "I don't want to hurt Emily. I can't hurt her." Beatrice's eyes softened, though her resolve was still firm. "You already have, Jason. Not in the way you think. But you've been keeping a secret from her. From both of us. The truth is, you've already betrayed her by letting this thing grow between us. By denying it, by avoiding it. That's the betrayal." Jason staggered back as if struck. "What are you saying? That I should just give in to this? That we should just let everything fall apart?" Beatrice didn't answer immediately. Instead, she closed the distance between them, her hand reaching for his. "I'm not asking you to give in. I'm asking you to admit what's real. I'm asking you to stop running from this. We've both felt it, and pretending it isn't there is only making things worse." Jason looked at her, his emotions a tangled mess of confusion and desire. "I don't know what to do, Beatrice. I can't even trust myself anymore. I don't know what's real." Beatrice leaned in, her voice a whisper. "It's real, Jason. It's real because we've both felt it. You've resisted, but there's only so much resistance one person can take. We've been testing each other, testing our limits. And now we need to face what comes next." Jason was silent, his mind racing. He had thought he could avoid this, thought he could control his feelings and stay loyal to Emily. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the emotional distance between him and Emily had been growing long before this moment. He had tried to push the thought of Beatrice out of his mind, but every time he saw her, every time their eyes met, the connection grew stronger. "I don't want to hurt Emily," Jason whispered again, but this time, there was a crack in his voice, a hint of vulnerability that Beatrice had been waiting for. "You won't hurt her by being honest, Jason. You will hurt her by continuing this lie. And we both know that the truth is what we need now." Jason's hands trembled as he reached for her, the pull between them undeniable. This wasn't just a physical attraction anymore. This was something deeper. Something he couldn't fight any longer. Beatrice had been right all along. He had already betrayed Emily by hiding from the truth, by denying the reality of what was happening between him and Beatrice. As he leaned in to kiss her again, something shifted within him. He wasn't just giving in to temptation. He was giving in to his own emotions, his own desires, and his own confusion. He had no idea where this would lead, but he knew that there was no turning back. And so, as their lips met once again, both Jason and Beatrice were fully aware of the consequences of their actions. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was the beginning of something far more dangerous. They were no longer playing a game. They were now caught in a web of lies and desires that would soon be impossible to untangle. The days following their second encounter were marked by an overwhelming sense of guilt that hung over Jason like a dark cloud. He had crossed a line, and he knew it. Each time he looked at Emily, who continued to be blissfully unaware, his heart would ache with a mixture of shame and confusion. He had promised himself he would never betray her, but now, everything felt like it was falling apart. His thoughts were consumed by Beatrice, by the moments they had shared, by the undeniable chemistry that neither of them could pretend wasn't there. Beatrice, too, was feeling the weight of their actions, but she was no longer willing to turn back. She had tested Jason, and she had gotten what she wanted, what they both wanted. But now, there was no denying the complexity of the situation. Jason was no longer just Emily's fiancé. He was someone she had fallen for. Someone she had become emotionally entangled with. But Beatrice wasn't naive. She knew that this wouldn't end well. Emily would find out, sooner or later, and when she did, it would destroy everything. But Beatrice also knew that there was no other choice now. What had started as a test had morphed into something far more dangerous. And no matter how hard they tried to fight it, they couldn't ignore what was happening between them. One evening, after dinner, Beatrice and Jason found themselves alone again. Emily had gone out with friends, leaving them in the house by themselves. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Jason stood by the window, his eyes looking out into the night as Beatrice stood a few feet away, her arms crossed. Neither of them knew where to begin. Finally, it was Beatrice who spoke, her voice low and steady. "We can't keep pretending this didn't happen, Jason." Jason's shoulders tensed, and he turned to face her. I know we can't, but I don't know what to do. I've already hurt Emily once. I can't hurt her again." I can't betray her like this. Beatrice stepped closer, her voice gentle but insistent. You already have, Jason. The longer we hide this, the worse it will be when she finds out. The truth will come out. And we both know it. We can't keep living in this lie. Jason felt his chest tighten, his breath shallow. But what if she never forgives me? What if I lose her forever? Beatrice reached out and placed a hand on his arm. We can't keep living in fear of what might happen. We have to face the consequences of our actions. And the consequences, Jason, are already here. Jason swallowed hard, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, they stood there, neither of them moving, both of them fully aware of the danger they were in. Jason knew that what he was about to do would change everything. He had to make a choice: continue down this path and risk everything he had with Emily, or walk away and try to salvage what little was left of his integrity. I'm sorry, Jason whispered, his voice breaking. I never meant for this to happen. Beatrice's expression softened. Neither did I. But it did, Jason. And now we have to deal with it. Just as Jason opened his mouth to respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway startled them both. It was Emily. They both froze, panic flooding through them. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he glanced toward the door, then back to Beatrice. He didn't know what to do, what to say. Emily walked into the house, her voice carrying through the hallway. Hey, guys, I'm back. Beatrice quickly stepped away from Jason, her heart racing. Jason turned to face Emily, forcing a smile as he tried to mask the turmoil inside him. Hey, Em, how was your night? It was good, Emily said, smiling as she walked into the living room. It's nice to have a night out. You know, I've been so busy lately. Jason nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He could feel Beatrice's eyes on him, could feel the tension between them, and he knew Emily couldn't sense it. Not yet. Beatrice smiled at Emily, her voice light. I'm glad you had a good time, sweetheart. Emily returned the smile. Unaware of the storm brewing between her fiancé and her mother, she walked over to the couch and sat down, clearly tired from her night out. Jason, could you grab me a glass of water? Jason hesitated, looking at Emily, then at Beatrice. He didn't know how much longer he could keep this charade going. Every glance, every word, felt like a lie now. But he did what he always did, what he was expected to do. He went to the kitchen, trying to act normal. As Jason stood by the counter, pouring the water, his mind raced. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the situation crushing him. He had been living a lie for weeks, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. He didn't know if he could face the consequences. He didn't know if he was ready to lose Emily. When he returned to the living room, Emily was still sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as he handed her the glass of water. Thanks, babe, she said, flashing a smile. But Jason could only manage a weak smile in return. Beatrice was sitting across from them, watching the exchange with a mixture of regret and something else, something darker. She had been testing Jason for so long, but now, with every passing moment, the consequences of their actions were becoming undeniable. As Emily sipped her water, Beatrice stood up and walked toward the kitchen. Jason followed her with his eyes, and for a brief moment, he was paralyzed by the weight of everything: the lies, the betrayal, the undeniable attraction. He had been tested, and now, it seemed, the final test had arrived. When Beatrice returned to the living room, she and Jason shared a fleeting look, a look that spoke volumes. They both knew what would happen next. Emily would soon find out, and their world would shatter. But neither of them could stop what was coming, and so, the storm that had been brewing for so long was about to break. The days that followed the tension-filled evening in the living room were unbearable for Jason. Every glance he exchanged with Beatrice seemed to be a reminder of the secret they were keeping, of the truth they were hiding from Emily. Every word he spoke to her felt like a lie, and every moment they spent together. He couldn't shake the sense of impending disaster. The weight of guilt was almost suffocating, but there was also something else, an undeniable pull toward Beatrice that Jason could no longer ignore. Emily, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the shifting dynamics between her mother and fiancé. She was busy with work and planning their upcoming wedding, unaware of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. To her, everything was still perfect. She was still excited about the future she and Jason would build together, and she had no reason to doubt him, to question his loyalty. She had no idea that the person she trusted the most had already betrayed her, and that the betrayal was only getting deeper. It wasn't until one fateful evening, when Emily came home early from a work event, that the facade finally cracked. Jason had just gotten back from a late meeting when he entered the house and found Emily sitting in the living room. There was something different about the way she was looking at him, something cold in her eyes. He felt his stomach tighten. Something was wrong. Jason, Emily said quietly, her voice strained. We need to talk. Jason's heart raced as he sat down beside her. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew it couldn't be good. What's going on, Em? He asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed her phone on the coffee table, her fingers tapping nervously. Jason's gaze flickered down to the phone, and his heart skipped a beat. There, on the screen, was a message that Emily had clearly just read. What is this? Emily asked, her voice breaking as she picked up the phone and handed it to him. Jason's hands trembled as he took the phone. He read the message on the screen. I can't stop thinking about you, Jason. I never expected this to happen, but now I can't imagine my life without you. Beatrice, the words hit him like a punch to the gut. His mouth went dry, and his mind raced as he looked at Emily, whose face had gone pale. He had never expected this moment to come so soon. He had hoped, naively, that he could bury the truth, that he could keep the secret just a little longer. But now, there was no escape. Emily, Jason started. But Emily cut him off. Don't, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Don't try to explain, Jason. I can see it in your eyes. I knew something was off, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that the man I was going to marry would betray me. Not like this. Jason felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had never wanted to hurt Emily, but he had done exactly that. And now, there was no way to take it back. Emily, please, just listen, Jason began, but she shook her head. No, I don't want to hear it. I saw the way you two looked at each other. I saw how you acted when she was around. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew, and now you're telling me that it's true. Her voice shook with the weight of her emotions. How could you do this to me, Jason? Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, and for the first time, Jason saw the full impact of what he had done. He had broken her heart, destroyed everything they had built together. The woman he had promised to love and protect had been betrayed by the two people she trusted the most. I never meant to hurt you, Emily, Jason said, his voice raw. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, but it did, and now there's no way to take it back. Emily stood up suddenly, her face flushed with anger and hurt. No, Jason, there's no going back. I can't be with someone who would do this to me. I can't look at you the same way anymore. She turned away from him, her back to him as she fought to hold back her tears. Jason could feel his own chest tightening, a painful lump forming in his throat. He wanted to reach out to her, to beg for her forgiveness, but he knew it was too late. The damage had been done. As the silence stretched between them, the door to the house opened, and Beatrice stepped inside. She froze when she saw the scene before her. Emily standing with her back to them, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. And Jason standing there, helpless and broken. Beatrice knew immediately that the truth had come out. Emily, Beatrice began, but Emily spun around to face her. No, don't, Emily said, her voice full of venom. I don't want to hear anything from you. Her voice cracked, but she regained her composure. You're the reason all of this happened. I never thought my own mother would do this to me. I trusted you both. But now I see that I was just a fool. Beatrice took a step back, her heart sinking. She had never wanted to hurt Emily like this, but it was too late. She had fallen for Jason in a way she never expected. And now, the fallout was inevitable. I'm so sorry, Emily, Beatrice said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I never meant for it to go this far. Emily shook her head, her eyes blazing with hurt. Don't apologize to me. You've already destroyed everything. Go ahead, Beatrice. Take him. You've already taken everything else from me. Beatrice stood frozen, unable to speak. Emily's words cut deep, but she knew they were true. Everything had changed. Jason was no longer her fiancé. He was her mother's lover, and the world they had once known was shattered beyond repair. Jason stood there, caught in the middle of a storm he had created. He had been the one to start this. But now, as everything unraveled, he didn't know how to fix it. He didn't know how to make things right again. As the silence stretched on, Emily turned and left the room, disappearing into the house. Beatrice and Jason were left alone, the weight of their actions pressing down on them. There was no going back. Everything had changed, and the consequences of their betrayal were now unavoidable. The days that followed the revelation were nothing short of a storm, with emotions running high and tempers flaring. Jason and Beatrice, once so sure of their secret bond, now found themselves in an entirely different world. What had begun as an affair driven by desire and a strange sense of inevitability had transformed into an emotional battlefield. The woman they had both betrayed, Emily, was no longer a part of their lives in the same way. She had distanced herself from both of them, retreating into the space of hurt and disbelief. Jason spent his nights awake, wrestling with his conscience. He knew that he could never undo the damage, but every part of him ached to make things right, even though he knew the task was insurmountable. His actions had ripped apart the foundation of a relationship he had once cherished, and now, as he stood next to Beatrice in the aftermath, he could see the void that their choices had left in their lives. Beatrice, too, was struggling. She had never expected to fall in love with Jason, never anticipated that their brief moments of passion would evolve into something so deep and undeniable. But as she sat in the quiet of their new, complicated reality, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. She had, in the end, chosen a path that was selfish and reckless, and the consequences were now clear for both of them. At the heart of it all, though, was Emily, the woman who had been betrayed by both her fiancé and her mother was the one most affected by the fallout. She had left the house after their confrontation, and no one knew where she had gone. Beatrice had tried to call her, to reach out, but every attempt had been met with silence. Emily was gone, and it felt like she had vanished into thin air. One evening, Jason found himself standing at the door to the house he once shared with Emily, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The desire to make things right, to explain himself, gnawed at him, but deep down, he knew that Emily would never forgive him. Not for what he had done, not for how he had betrayed her trust in the worst way possible. Beatrice, sensing his hesitation, stood behind him in the doorway. She had been silent for days, unsure of what to do or say. She had been waiting for Jason to make the first move, to fix the mess they had created together. But now, seeing him at the door, she felt a pang of doubt. "Jason," Beatrice began softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should just leave it alone. Maybe she doesn't want to hear from us." Jason turned to look at her, his face lined with frustration and regret. "I can't just do that, Beatrice. I can't live with myself knowing I've destroyed everything, our relationship, Emily's trust, everything." Beatrice stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with understanding, though a part of her was unsure as well. "But maybe you need to accept that there's no fixing this. Maybe you need to let her go." Jason shook his head, pushing past her. "I can't. I won't. I owe her at least this." He opened the door and stepped outside, walking into the cool evening air. Beatrice stayed behind, her gaze following him. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of the guilt dragging him down. But she also felt a nagging emptiness in her heart. The bond they shared was undeniable, but it had come at such a steep price. And now, she wondered if it was all worth it. Jason knocked on the door of the house he had once called home. His knuckles were white from the force of his fist. He waited, every second stretching into eternity. When no one answered, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. The house was quiet, eerily so, with no sign of Emily. He called out her name, but there was no response. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved further into the house, his eyes scanning the rooms for any trace of her. It wasn't until he reached the kitchen that he saw it, a note. It was folded neatly on the counter, its edges crisp. He picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hands. Jason unfolded the note with trembling fingers and read the words inside. "Jason, I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not. I can't live in a world where you and my mother are together. I never asked for any of this, but I've seen enough. I'm leaving. Don't try to find me." Emily, the words hit him like a freight train. His throat tightened, and for a moment, everything around him seemed to blur. He had lost her not just as a fiancé, but as someone who had once trusted him completely. And now, she was gone. Jason felt the tears welling up, but he wiped them away angrily, unwilling to show any more weakness. He had done this. He had driven her away. Turning, he made his way back toward the door, but Beatrice was standing in the hallway now, her face filled with concern. "Jason, what happened?" Jason clenched his jaw, his face pale. "She's gone, Beatrice. Emily's gone, and it's my fault. I've lost everything." Beatrice's heart sank. She knew the devastation in Jason's voice, the depth of the pain he was feeling, but she also knew that this was the moment they had to face the truth. There was no going back from here. Their relationship, born out of betrayal and secrecy, was now the only thing left. As Jason stood there, broken and lost, Beatrice walked over to him and put her arms around him. Despite the situation, despite the mess they had created, she knew this was the moment that would change everything. They were all each other had now. But as the realization sank in, Beatrice also knew there would be no happy ending. They had chosen this path, and now they had to live with the consequences. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet between Jason and Beatrice grew increasingly heavy. Emily's absence cast a long shadow over their lives. And as much as they tried to move forward, the reality of their actions loomed over them. Jason's guilt was suffocating, while Beatrice tried to hold on to the fragile hope that somehow, in time, everything could be repaired. But as time passed, the weight of their choices only seemed to deepen. Beatrice was beginning to question everything: her feelings for Jason, the choices that had led them here, and whether any of it was truly worth it. She had never imagined her life would take such a dark turn, and yet, here she was, tangled in a web of lies, hurt, and betrayal. Jason, too, was struggling to reconcile the person he had become with the man he had once prided himself on being. His heart ached every time he thought about Emily, about how he had shattered the trust they once shared. He spent his nights trying to find solace in work or in the distractions Beatrice offered, but nothing seemed to ease the constant ache in his chest. Then, one day, everything changed. Jason had been sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through some old papers when Beatrice entered, her face pale and drawn. She looked different, more distant, as though the weight of their reality had finally become too much to bear. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but soft. Jason looked up, his heart sinking. He had known this moment would come. The moment when everything would finally fall apart. About what? Beatrice hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I can't do this anymore, Jason. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay. I thought I could, but I can't." Jason's heart stopped. He rose to his feet, his chest tight with panic. "What are you talking about? I love you," Beatrice said, her voice quivering with emotion. "But I can't keep living in the shadow of what we've done. I can't keep being a part of something that's broken beyond repair. It's not fair to either of us." Jason took a step toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Please don't try to fix this. It's too late." For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Jason felt like the world was crumbling around him, the life he had chosen for himself slipping away. "I'm sorry," Beatrice whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I have to go." Before Jason could respond, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing in the empty silence of the house. The door closed behind her with a finality that made Jason's heart shatter. He had lost her just like he had lost everything else. He sank to the floor, his body trembling with emotion. What had he done? He had hurt the people he loved the most, and now, it seemed, there was no going back. Days passed in a blur. Jason continued to go through the motions, but there was no joy in it. The emptiness inside him grew larger, and every corner of the house seemed to echo with the absence of Emily and Beatrice. He had driven them both away, and now he was alone. But even in the silence, there was a nagging thought at the back of his mind, a thought that refused to go away. What if he could fix this? What if there was still a way to make things right? One evening, as Jason sat in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey, the doorbell rang. He stood up slowly, his heart racing, unsure of who it might be. He opened the door, and there, standing in front of him, was Emily. Her eyes were tired, her face drawn with the weight of everything that had happened, but she was there, and for a moment, Jason thought he might pass out from the shock of it all. "Emily," Jason breathed, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, her gaze steady but filled with something he couldn't quite read. Then, finally, she spoke. "I don't know what to say to you, Jason," Emily said, her voice soft but firm. "But I've been thinking a lot. I've been thinking about everything we had, everything I thought we had. And I've come to a conclusion." Jason's heart raced. "What is it?" Emily took a deep breath before speaking again. "You don't get to have everything, Jason. You don't get to destroy my life and then expect me to forgive you. I can't do that. But I also can't keep running away from the truth. I can't keep hiding from the hurt you caused me." Jason's throat tightened as the weight of her words sank in. "I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen." "I know," Emily said, her eyes softening. "But it's too late for apologies, Jason. We've both done things we can't undo." Jason nodded slowly, feeling the truth of her words settle deep within him. There was no going back. There was no undoing the damage that had been done. And as much as he wanted to make things right, He knew that the reality of their situation was something they both had to live with. I hope you find peace, Jason, Emily said, her voice cracking slightly. And I hope you figure out how to live with yourself. With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Jason stood there for a long time, the weight of everything crashing down on him. He had lost everything. His relationship with Emily was gone, and his future with Beatrice was just as uncertain. All he had left was the aftermath of his choices, and the cold, empty silence that followed. And as the door clicked shut behind him, Jason realized that the only thing left to do was move forward. No matter how hard it might be, no matter how broken he felt, he had to keep going. Because, in the end, there was nothing else to hold on to.